Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Your Spiritual Journey. This is Dr. Bob Dove, and we're here to talk about things that are real and things that affect you as well as the rest of us. I'm well deep into season 3 now, and we're looking at getting as much support as we can, so feel free to like us, to follow us, to subscribe on YouTube, and donate on Patreon, whatever floats your boat. But we're here for you, so we hope that you'll be here for us. Today's guest is Rob A. Gentile. He's the son of Italian immigrants. His father worked in a steel mill, and he grew up in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, not very far from where we're broadcasting from. He spent his career as a sales engineer in the steel industry, and he's married to Melanie for over 30 years, and they've devoted themselves to their special needs daughter, Maria. I have to say that I just finished Rob's book, and you can see it here, Quarks of Light, and it definitely had me going through an entire box of tissues. I had to stop a number of times for tears, but I highly recommend it. It's an amazing read, and it's got an amazing story. So I guess what I'd like to lead with, even though we usually have our guests get to all the high points in their spiritual journey, is that throughout Maria's childhood, Rob grappled with difficult questions about prayer and why children must suffer. And those answers came in a sudden and unexpected way. At age 56, he had a massive heart attack, flatlined, and then had a near-death experience. Self-discovery and spiritual awakening continued while waiting to receive a donor heart, and this is his first book. So, Rob, maybe you could fill us in a little bit from your childhood and what your religious and spiritual background was growing up in a steel town, and then I'll pepper you with some questions from your book. But I got to tell you, I just loved your book.
Thank you so much, Bob, and I'm delighted to be here. It's an honor to be here to share my story with you. Thank you for having me. I was raised in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, as you mentioned. My parents were Italian immigrants. My father and mother came in through Ellis Island. And actually, my grandfather came first, and he ended up in Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation in Aliquippa. My father, when he came to this country, also went into the steel mill. And we were pretty much, just a very, very small family. There were 4 boys. I'm the youngest of 4 boys. And my dad worked in the mill. And when I was 5 years old, unfortunately, my father had died as a result of a steel mill accident. But I was raised Catholic. My mother was a very devout Catholic, as was my father. So being raised Catholic, I had, my own set of spiritual beliefs that I was raised with. And I could tell you that as I grew up and got into adulthood and then started to experience things in my own life, particularly when I died at age 56, all of those belief systems were shaken to the core, and I had a huge paradigm shift in how I see my place with my Creator and my spiritual belief system. So all of those things had shifted profoundly when I had my experience.
Yeah. So there's a number of, I don't know, there are just so many points of interest within your book. And there are some things that just really stood out to me. For instance, a comment that you make is, you don't have to leave the earth to experience the divine. And, many of us have that belief
Yes.
that well, the only way to experience, you can believe and you can mentally process the concept of the divine, but to experience it, well, that's another story. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So, what the interesting thing about that is, Bob, is that when I had my near-death experience, I was transplanted in Chicago, so I had to live in Chicago. I was there for a year because after you get transplanted, the hospital is responsible for anything that should happen to you. So that first year is absolutely critical because if you have a rejection or an infection or something, and you pass, the hospital can lose its license for transplant. So after going through everything that I had gone through, and I got my heart, I was living in Chicago in an apartment. Of course, my wife and daughter were back here in North Carolina, and my wife can only come up periodically to see me. So even though I had some family members come for the first 3 months, I couldn't be alone. After everyone had left, it was then that I really started to go through a very deep depression because during my near-death experience, I was taken up into a place that I call the ethereal in my book, which is kind of like, it certainly wasn't heaven, but it's this in-between place, as I described, that where the veil is kind of like just pulled back enough for me to get a glimpse of that spiritual realm. And, we'll talk about that spiritual realm, but when I was there, the beauty and the peace and everything that I experienced was obviously completely different from what is happening in this temporal physical world that we live in. We all grapple with why do horrible things happen to people? Why is there war? Why are children starving? All of these things that we deal with. And it was there that I began to really question why I had been brought back. What's the meaning of all this? And I was going through my meditations every morning in prayer, and I was trying to get back to that place, that ethereal, and connect with that love and light of the Creator and be at peace. And every morning I would fail miserably. And what happened is that my boss at the time, who was Chinese American, who had been converted to Christianity about 7 years ago, he knew that I was struggling. So he called me one morning and he said, "Hey, I want to bring my pastor over to talk with you." And I said, "No, Paul, don't worry about that. Don't bring this guy over. He speaks Chinese and doesn't speak English very well. And I really don't have time to see this guy." But he insisted. So it was a transformative meeting because the pastor's name was Pastor Mann, M-A-N. And I'm sitting out on my porch, and here comes Pastor Mann, a very wonderful little Chinese man who'd been a pastor for 20, 30 years. And he came up and he sat down next to me, and I felt safe and comfortable talking to him. And I told him, I said, "Pastor Mann, I have such guilt about, first of all, getting my heart. When I was getting transplanted, there were people on my floor, younger people that never got a heart. They passed away. And, I feel like I don't deserve this heart. And, why me?" And I said, "The worst part of this whole thing is that I really don't know where I belong." I said, "Because I had this incredible spiritual experience, and now I'm coming back to earth, and I know that I've got to help take care of my daughter Maria and wife, but I just really don't know where I belong." And he said, "Rob, you don't know where you belong because you've gotten too fat being fed too much in that spiritual world. So to get thin again, I want you to give back to God in all the things that you do. And there you'll experience love and kindness and appreciation." And he said, "You don't have to leave the earth to experience the divine." And it was in that moment when he left that I decided to take a walk through a park nearby. And when I was a kid, I remember I used to, walk through the woods and pull leaves off of trees and squeeze them in my hands and, ask them to give me their energy. And I was just full of wonder and life and seeing how beautiful nature was. And I was actually seeing the divine in creation. And then it hit me, that's what he was talking about. To see this beautiful creation that is all around us and within each other, and to see the good things and focus on the good things in life. And it was there that I had this huge paradigm shift in how I started to view the world, understanding that certainly bad things still happen in the world, but coming to grips with the only thing that we can control are our own actions, but the Creator controls the outcome. And when we let go of that and understand that we really don't control anything in the end, we can find that peace within ourselves.
Okay, so I get it. That's there's so much wisdom in this book, and I guess I feel like so much wisdom that you've gained on this journey.
Yeah.
And when I read the first part of your book, I thought, boy, this sounds like Job. He's had everything thrown at him possibly. And to maintain his faith through all this adversity. And yet you do a good job in the book of questioning that faith at the same time. Like, we get the impression that he's maintaining his faith. No, he's losing his faith. No, he's got it back. He's losing it again. Could you talk a little bit about that struggle and how you got through it? Because, boy, it sure seemed like a grind, and you were brought to your knees a number of times.
Yes, very much so. Well, it's a great question, Bob, because it's part of the human condition, and all of us grapple with faith, and particularly when we're faced with hardship, we wonder, whatever our belief system is, and whatever our version of God is, regardless of what the religion is, we all grapple with, oh my goodness, my child has cancer. How can a loving God allow this to happen? So just like me, and I've been told by many a pastor, priest, and educators throughout, as the book came out and people were contacting me, that I've been called the modern day Job. So I'm glad you picked up on that. But here's what I found about faith and about adversity. Adversity, when it's put in perspective, could be an invitation for us to build a closer relationship with God. Because it's there that when we're really pinned up against the corner, when we're really pressed to figure out what we believe in and who we are, it's there that two things happen. Either we're crushed by adversity and we drift into the darkness and decide to deal with adversity through alcohol or drugs or whatever that addiction is, or we find strength in it because we realize that this is where the Creator has an opportunity to really get into our soul and into the core of our being and help us find that strength. And that's what happened to me. And there was another really important character in the book. I call him the Rev, Reverend Greg, who's actually from Pittsburgh. And I met him serendipitously, supposedly. And he had taught me that faith and fear are the same thing. Faith is the belief that good things are going to happen, and fear is the belief that bad things are going to happen. And we have to make a choice as to how we're going to live. So we have to choose between faith and fear. And I found that to be brilliant. And I adopted that into my own belief system. And it's really helped me. Even now, my daughter Maria, who has Rett syndrome, she still can't walk, talk, feed herself. So that is a daily struggle where, I'm always fighting this faith and fear thing. And sometimes, I have to be careful not to allow myself to go down that slippery slope and realize that, Maria, for me, has been a great spiritual teacher because she always keeps me anchored and always reminds me that, hey, I don't really control anything. And my purpose here is to help her get through this temporal world and over into that spiritual realm where she's perfect and whole. So that's what I learned through grappling with faith.
And I think the ability to see perfection in what appears to be imperfection is such a gift, because once you can do that, then looking out at any imperfection, you can see the perfection that's really there. But it's a it's a big struggle to at least see that the first time around. So
it comes through, the meaning of life, though, Bob, I've learned comes through the struggle. I haven't learned anything of value while I'm on vacation. It's always through the struggle in life that we're forced to deal with who we really are and dig deep. And, and this is where I think identity comes in and where our belief system comes in. And when we realize that, we come from this divine source of love and light, it helps us deal with the physicality, the suffering, and our time on this level of consciousness.
Yeah. So in some ways, we're talking about a dichotomy, though, because you're looking at struggle as being core on the one hand, and on the other hand, releasing control and turning it over to God. So what's that balance between struggle and release, and where do you find it?
Well, I tell you, it's, for me personally, it's been in letting go. And when I let go and let God and understand that, again, I don't control any of this. I'll never forget when I first got to the University of Chicago, which is where I got my heart. I couldn't get a heart here anywhere. So my employer, through like a Hollywood moment, my company is based in Chicago, and I didn't know the owner, and my company is a philanthropist, and he helped me get into the University of Chicago Medicine. And I was really blessed to have a doctor by the name of Dr. Juvenandan, who's a world famous heart transplant surgeon. He's transplanted over 1,500 people, including his own wife. And I never forget, he walked into my room one day and sat down. And he said to me, he said, what have you learned from your heart attack? And I said, well, what do you mean? What have I learned? And he said, I think you know exactly what I mean. And then it hit me. I said, I don't control anything. And he said, you're exactly right. I don't control anything either. I just want you to understand that, because there's a million things that can go wrong if and when you get a heart. So he's the one that taught me that the only thing that we can do, and as that conversation went on, he explained to me, he said, I'm going to do the best of my ability as a physician. But in the end, it's God that controls the outcome. And if you have to understand that if the Creator thinks that you're best leaving this planet now and going to that spiritual home, then you have to come to terms with that. So again, Bob, I've had all these magnificent teachers on this journey that helped me deal with some of these, huge life questions that we all want answered.
Yeah, including a man in a turban, uh,
Yes.
who was a big surprise when he opened your eyes after the transplant, uh, and that really intrigued me because I recently interviewed a Sikh on this program, and
Okay.
learned an awful lot about Sikhism, and so I was able to, I don't know, really identify with some of the things that you said, and that it was interesting that you uh, took interest enough to do the research to find out the basic tenets of what he was all about as a Sikh. Uh,
Yeah. Incredible belief system. The Sikhs believe that we're all born good and that we're called to serve one another. And that's why in the book, when I came out of my coma, it was Dr. Bajwa that was the Sikh that was kind of shaking me awake. He's the one that put the 2 stents in my heart that night that I had my heart attack. And that's why I said that when I opened my eyes and I first saw him, it was almost as if he was holding the hope of the whole world in his eyes. And now I understand it, because when I came back a year later and interviewed him for the book, that's when he told me about his belief system. And I thought to myself, wow, what a beautiful vision of the human race, that we're born good and we're called to serve one another. You see, that's the hope for all humanity. And I thought to myself, wow, that makes me want to learn more about Sikhism and become a Sikh, because that's a beautiful, again, a beautiful vision.
yeah, I recently was doing some research myself and looking at all of the world's religions, and the Sikh religion is actually the most recent in terms of being founded, and in terms of its belief system. If we look at all of the world's religions, they were very appropriate for their time and place in their culture. But I think it behooves us
Yeah.
all to take a strong look at what the Sikhs are all about, because just across the board, I think it's fundamental. What they've got is fundamental to all religion and all spirituality. So I'm with you on that. I just love the basic tenets of that group. Okay, I'm going to take you back into your book because one of the analogies that you use, and you use a lot, and they really they're really grabbers. But when you looked at Santa and Rudolph and the island of misfit toys, and I just thought how perfect the way that you captured what was going on at the time, and using that analogy, because I don't know, I guess our family's also uh, fans of Rudolph and that whole
Yeah.
scene. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And you're going to bring me to tears now. That scene had always impressed me as a child because, um, being raised without a father in a steel town, in a rough and tumble steel town, was always considered a weakness. So growing up for me was a very unpleasant experience. And even when I got involved in Cub Scouts, and I was always teased and bullied, and because I didn't have a father, and I had always felt like a misfit. I'd always felt like a misfit, even when I experienced in my crib as I opened the book with that glowing orb that had descended on me before my father passed away. Um, that spiritual light had come to me early as a child. So I had always been kind of different, and I never really fit into school. I never did sports except for martial arts, but I was always a loner, and I had always felt like a misfit. And then, you know, so when I had my daughter Maria, and we found out that she had Rett syndrome, um, and she is deeply affected and completely handicapped. Now the world sees her as a misfit, and I thought to myself, wow, what is going on? And when I went through this whole experience of after I had flatlined that night, and I had all this equipment piled up on me, and I was the one with special needs, and the world frowned upon me because I had, a defibrillator vest on and a battery pack, and I had another battery pack because I had a port in my chest, squirting medicine on my heart, and walking around. I looked like this, cyborg creature from some kind of science fiction movie, and people were just, wanted to be away from me. And a lot of times they treat my daughter that way, particularly other children. So I realized when I had come back from heart transplant and I was holding Maria, and it was Christmas and we were watching that show, I had realized then, after having my near-death experience, that there really are no misfits. We're all born from that same love and light of the Creator. And the Creator didn't cause any of these problems. It's just how things happen. And typically most of them are man-made. But so it was there that I finally released that belief that I was a misfit and that my daughter was a misfit. And I understood that, we're all the same. We're all born out of that divine web of love and light, and that we're perfect and whole, just as we are.
Yeah, that's I don't know, that's such a core message, I think, not only from your book, but for all of us to try to understand and to not just believe, but to know, that's the very core of our being. And,
The difference between believing and knowing, yes.
Yeah. I just love the messages that are throughout your book.
Thank you.
So another one of those messages is only when choosing in freedom does a human being come to life. And I'd like you to go a little deeper with that, or just, talk about what you mean by that.
Well, I believe that, there are things in life that the vicissitudes and challenges and that we talked about earlier, that circumstances in one's life that come to us all. And these are things that can either drag us into the darkness, or these are things that we, again, back to adversity, that we deal with head on. And I believe it's when we understand our real identity, and we really get the concept of that we're born out of this divine love and light of the Creator. It's then when we choose to do the right thing and to allow this divine love and light to express through us. This is one of the biggest messages that I got from my experience, that God expresses and experiences life through us. It's the only way it can be designed. Since God is spirit, then how else would he be able to express his creation or his love, but through the creations, whether it be animals, nature, human beings? So when we choose in freedom, when I talk about freedom, it's the freedom of knowing and the freedom of really understanding this concept of who we are, So we don't let these vicissitudes of life, all of these problems drag us down. If we could just remember our real identity and choose in freedom without all these other attachments and not allowing ourselves to fall victim to addictions, whatever they are, all of these or bad habits or negative thinking that don't allow us to express freely that divine love and light that comes through us, not from us. And this is where I believe that purpose comes into our life. And this is where, when I was part of that web, and I'm sure we'll get to it, that I became part of, and I realized that I was not my body, my race, or my religion, and that we were all connected, and that God uses light to create, heal, and transform us. It was then that I knew that freedom exists in that place and that we have the ability to do that. And that freedom comes from serving others. The lights that I saw in that experience, in that ethereal, when I saw that web, the lights that were shining the brightest were those that were allowing this light to spread through them and into the world by serving others. So that's what I mean by choosing in freedom.
So there's a concept that you seem to accept by saying this is the only way that this could possibly work, in that we are God experiencing the world. That the old cliche among Christians anyway is we are the hands and feet of God. But often that's kind of like a throwaway line. Like it is a push to serve others.
Yep.
But there's also a deeper meaning there, that this is how God participates in physicality. I mean, that's who we are. We are God participating in physicality. And to some, that would sound blasphemous. Like, what do you mean you're God?
Yeah.
So as you stated it, you said this is really the only way that this can work. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, that was, it was a culmination of the entire experience, but it was mostly what I saw in that ethereal space, and then watching the world as I came out of that, and watching how the world interacts, and those that were there for me, and those that really allowed that divine love and light to express through them, like these doctors along the way that helped save me. They had a choice. I always talk about, like, Dr. Patel. When I interviewed her, I thought that was brilliant. She was the Indian woman that came in that night, and she was the one that refused to give up on me and kept on doing those chest compressions and working on me for 20 minutes when, she should have walked away a long time ago. But when I asked her, what her belief system was, and she said to me, yeah, I believe that, God is the ultimate savior, creator, gave me the wisdom and the patience to become a doctor, but he also gave me free will. She said, I had to get in there that night, roll up my sleeves and do those chest compressions and start working on you because I had to take action. I had to do the deed. So all of these doctors taught me along the way that it is through taking action, much like prayer. We could pray as much as we want to, but we have to, at some point, take action. We could pray to feed the homeless people, but sooner or later, we're going to have to bring some bread to the homeless shelter and actually give it to them, because it's not going to fall from heaven. So this is how I believe that it works. And again, it's through this culmination of my entire experience from the night that I almost died to heart transplant and then coming back into the world and seeing that how those brightest lights, you know, had saved my life along the way. And it was, for me, it's been a pattern that I wanted to follow, which is why I decided to write the book. And I'm the last guy in the world that had time to write the book. I have a full-time job. I have a special needs child. But I knew that I had to get this message out to help others understand that we're here to let the divine express through us, and the rest is folly.
Yeah. Yeah. So prior to the heart attack, you had maybe a short experience that gave you some clue as to what might happen next, because you did have another NDE, a smaller one, prior to this. So what was the message from that first one? Or, what was the relationship, I guess, in your mind from the first one to the second one?
Oh, good question. So the first NDE was the night that I died. And what had happened to me, Bob, is that, out of nowhere, it's 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and I feel this. I'm in bed with my wife, and I feel this searing pain in the back of my neck that I have never felt before in my life. And it wakes me up, and I start screaming in pain and thrashing around in the bed. And of course, my wife is startled, and she wakes up and thinks it might be my daughter Maria having seizures. She runs down the hall. Maria's asleep, comes back in there and turns on the light, and it's me flopping around like a fish. And it was shortly after that the pain was so intense I just passed out. And she calls 911. Thank God, these guys get there quickly. And the hospital is only 3 miles from my house. So they wheel me into the ER, and they know I'm having a massive heart attack. So they give me whatever they give you to stabilize, probably, blood thinners, whatever it is. And they put me in a room with my wife and a nurse, and the nurse says, the cardiologist isn't in the hospital. We've called the cardiologist, but he should be fine until the cardiologist gets here. And as soon as the nurse said that, my wife says that it was like a scene from the movie The Exorcist. I was laying on the gurney, unconscious, and all of a sudden, it was as if somebody grabbed me by my shirt and just pulled me forward with great force. And I sprung forward on the gurney from my waist up. You can imagine, scared the heck out of everybody. And my eyes popped wide open, and I screamed out the name Frosty. And then I just collapsed backward on the gurney. Code blue rang out through the hospital. In comes Dr. Patel with a couple of assistants, and my wife is there. And before they take my wife out of the room, she's not going to make it without him. You have to save his life, because I can't do this alone. Talk about pressure, right, for the poor doctor. So they take my wife out of the room. She drops to her knees, begins to pray out loud to God to save me. Dr. Patel starts to work on me. She starts the resuscitation procedures. A minute goes by, 2 minutes go by, 5 minutes go by, 10 minutes go by. Paddle shocks, they're sticking that epinephrine needle in my heart. Everything that they could do, I'm not coming back. My organs are shutting down. 20 minutes go by. Finally, Dr. Bajwa arrives, the Sikh. He does an emergency cath through my thigh, finds the blockage in my Widowmaker, inserts 2 stents, but it was too late. I'm in respiratory failure, cardiogenic shock. Dr. Carson arrives, intubates me, and now I lay in a 4-day coma. Now, what happened is that when I came out of coma, Melanie my wife was the first one to enter the room. My arms were paralyzed. And she said that I was talking in this high-pitched voice like a child, and I said, Melanie, you have to believe me. You have to believe me. It was, and I had no idea what happened to me. She's the one that told me, hey, you got a heart attack. You've been out for 4 days. And I said, you have to believe me. It was Frosty. It was Frosty. He came to me. And she said, oh my God, makes total sense. And I said, what do you mean it makes total sense? She said, right before you flatlined, you sprang forward on the gurney, you shouted out Frosty's name, and then you collapsed. And she said, tell me exactly, what did Frosty say to you? And Frosty said to me, I've made a big mess out of things. You have to go back and help clean things up, but tell my family I'm in a good place. So to give you some background there, Frosty was my brother-in-law. He was my age, 56 at the time. And he had been living in the upstairs bedroom of his parents' house. He had been going through a divorce and one child in college. It was around Christmas. Frosty had a drug addiction, but he had been clean for a number of years. And, you know, he was a surveyor, had his own business, and just, you know, how at the holidays, a lot of pressure was piling up on Frosty. And he went out just to blow off some steam and thought, just one more time, I'll do a little bit of whatever he was doing. And he picked up a really bad street drug, and it drove him crazy for like 45 minutes. And he had come back to his parents' house and took his own life. So his mother had called me. It was like 5:30 in the morning, and it was 7 weeks before I had died that night. And she said, can you come to the house and go up into his bedroom and see if you can find a note or a journal or something that would explain why Frosty did this. So I got to tell you, Bob, it was a gruesome scene, but I went up there 7 times and finally found a journal that I gave to the family. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was on the second day, Dr. Patel comes to my bed. Of course, I didn't know who she was. And she pulls up a chair, sits down beside me, and she knew my arms were paralyzed, and she puts her hand on mine, and she explains that I'm Dr. Patel, I'm the one that worked on you, and she began to get very emotional and talk about how many times she almost lost me, and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, it got very personal. And she began to talk about her father. And I'm thinking to myself, why is she talking about her father? And she said to me, you know, Rob, my father and I were very close. We can read each other's minds. He helped me through medical school. And all he wanted to do was live long enough to see my first child that I was pregnant with. And she said 6 months before my child was born, my son was born, my father died of an aneurysm unexpectedly. And she said, you know, since then, I used to be a very spiritual person, but since then, I've been very bitter. I've kind of lost my spirituality. I don't feel my father's presence anymore. And she said, but you know, maybe, just maybe, there's something else out there, because seeing you here alive, which you shouldn't be, gives me hope. So it was in that moment that it was kind of like the puzzle unscrambled, and it hit me, because another male spirit had entered the room when Dr. Patel was working on me. And all I could hear was the same thing over and over again. Don't give up. Keep working on him. You can save him. Don't give up. You can save him. Over and over and over again. And it hit me. It was her father speaking through me. Although she couldn't hear him, something was driving her. Something was driving her not to give up. And, you know, I didn't have the courage to tell her in that moment, because she would have thought I was crazy. It wasn't until I came back after heart transplant and interviewed her that I told her the story, that it was her father. And so now, on his birthday, every year we have a chat, you know, about her dad. And that changed her whole perspective. And I told her, I said, your father's been with you the whole time. And that was him that night, encouraging you, letting you know that he's still with you. It was a very emotional moment for her. So 2 things came out of that first near-death experience. One, it was Frosty that changed my entire concept of heaven and hell and our Creator. I had never really understood, and I know that, and I love the Catholic faith, and I know they've changed the rules since then, which kind of bothered me because it's, these are man-made rules. But when I grew up, I was taught that taking one's life was a mortal sin, and there was no pass go, straight to hell you went. That was it. You were condemned. But Frosty told me he was in a good place. And I felt that peace emanating from him. And he was, all these demons and all of his addictions and all of his anxiety and problems were gone. They didn't follow him into that spiritual realm. He was free and happy and at peace. And I thought to myself, well, how can that be? He certainly isn't in hell. So that was an enormous paradigm shift in my belief system. And then having heard, Dr. Patel's father come to her and encourage her made me realize that we're spiritual beings first, having a human experience. And I also, and it took me years to understand this, but if Frosty hadn't come to me, not only would I have not ever challenged my religious belief system, but I never would have been prepared for the second and most profound near-death experience that I had in Chicago before my heart came. Because it was there that I almost died a second time and had that most profound near-death experience, which the book is entitled after, Quarks of Light. So that was, those were the two big lessons that came out of that near-death experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like it felt to you, and it felt in reading your book, that you were being prepared so that you could accept what was coming next and what was coming next. Although it was difficult for you to accept that you had gotten the transplant when others younger than you didn't get it. And then you went on to really look into whose heart you actually got. And that again is quite a story, sort of a story within the story. And there were so many synchronicities throughout this process. And I distinctly remember and can still picture in my mind the dream that you had of the girl coming out of the forest with cuts on her arms, and then suddenly a whole group of girls coming out of the forest also with cuts on their arms, and then really coming closer and closer to you. And that particular dream, then, and you said when you woke up you weren't sure how to interpret it at that point. So could you relate a little bit? Because I know this could take a whole hour in itself. But just to give us maybe 5 minutes of what happened when you finally discovered who donated their heart to you and what you found out about her.
Sure. So, that whole experience of getting transplanted, and I'll never forget before I left back in New York, but at the time, Dr. Uriel, who was the head of the heart failure department at University of Chicago Medicine, he had told me, he said, Rob, science has found a way to put a heart in another human being, but he said, I got to tell you, we really don't know what we're doing. He said, spiritually, we really don't know what we're doing. And he said, you're going to understand this after you get transplanted. And I certainly did. Because I'll never forget coming out of transplant, and waking up to this pounding in my chest. I was holding on to the bed rails of the bed, and then there was this pounding going on. And when I first woke up, I thought to myself, "Oh my God, what have I done? There's another human being living inside me." And from the moment that I got this heart, this donor started to express inside me. And I'll fast forward because I didn't know what was going on, but I started to research when I was living in Chicago how this is possible. And I discovered that, which is probably one of the most fascinating things, and I continue to study about now, is what makes heart transplant work and what's so different about the heart. And throughout our collective consciousness in all of humanity, as you know, it's all these aphorisms about the heart. It's, with a sad heart, with a broken heart, with a follow your heart, with all of these things. It's all about the heart, even in the Bible or regardless of the Torah or whatever religious text you talk about. It's all about the heart. And here I come to find out that through research, science has now proven that the heart has a brain, and that we've gotten it all wrong all these years. It's really not the brain telling the heart what to do. It's the heart telling the brain what to do. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because, first of all, basic biology, it's the heart that forms first in the mother's womb. It's the heart that's pumping the blood and nutrients and oxygen to the rest of, the body. And so this relationship between the heart and the brain start immediately. And it's there that these pathways are built between the heart and the brain. So memories are stored there in the heart, and a lot of our preferences for food and music and all of these things are in this heart brain. And the heart communicates with the brain in 4 ways. It communicates neurologically, it communicates biophysically, which is our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. It communicates through hormone production. And the most fascinating one is that it communicates through an electromagnetic field that emanates from the heart, and it comes out more than 100 feet in circumference around us. And it's through this electromagnetic field that we communicate with other human beings and animals without language. That's where our intuition comes from. We feel things before we think them, which is the entire premise behind advertising, right? So advertising doesn't talk about or focus on the logical brain, because if you went and bought a car based on a car commercial, they don't talk anything about how many miles you'll get out of this thing or its safety record or anything else. It's all about emotions and feelings. So, and this is how we pretty much operate. It's the heart that's really running the show. So this donor started to express through me in big ways. And I didn't know what was going on. I started to have feelings and emotions that weren't my own, and taste in food had changed, and music, and all of these things were happening. And it took me 2 years to find out who the donor was. And I'll never forget, because I was getting desperate. You have to wait a year to write your first letter, and you write the letter to the organ donation agency anonymously, and then they send that letter to the donor family, and the donor family has the right to either deny or connect with you. So I kept on writing letters, and I wasn't getting any response, and I was going crazy because all these things were happening. My wife was telling me I'm driving in the middle of the road, and I'm eating M&Ms, and I've never eaten junk food before. All this crazy stuff was happening. So finally, I called. I asked some of the other transplant folks that gotten transplanted with me on my floor how they found out about their donor, and they said, "Well, you call the Gift of Hope in Chicago and ask for this wonderful woman named Susan Cochran, and I think she'll help you." So I called Susan. And I told her what was happening to me. I said, Susan, you got to help me. I mean, I'm driving in the middle of the road and eating M&Ms. I'm going to die again. And she said, well, I'll tell you what, Rob, let me clear your file. So she pulls my file and she said, oh, you know what? The dad called us and reached out and wanted to know more about you because your last letter was actually read at the celebration of life for his child. But he doesn't write letters and he doesn't use a computer, but he wanted to know more about you. So she said, you know what? That allows me to break protocol. I'm going to call him and ask him if he'll talk to you. So 2 days go by. She calls me. She said, Rob, I've got good news. The dad said he'll talk to you. And I said, oh my God, Susan, tell me everything about him. Tell me everything about his son. What was his name? How did he die? And she said, I can't tell you anything about the death, but I can tell you one thing. It's not his son. I said, well, who is it? She said, daughter. I said, daughter? What do you mean daughter? And she said, yes, her name is Molly, and she was 20 years old. At the time, my daughter was 20 years old. Molly was born 3 months before my daughter, Maria. And, you know, this is another one of those things in the book. And, you know, I coined the phrase in the book that coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. And I really believe that because here was Molly, who always wanted to work with special needs children. And her dad was telling me even all throughout high school, you know, she would stand up to bullies who were picking on special needs kids. Molly was a natural born artist, never took a lesson, and her specialty was pencil drawings. My mom was a natural born artist whose specialty was pencil drawings, and a lot of their pictures or drawings were the same. Then I come to find out that Molly's favorite flower was the daisy, so much so that she had a daisy tattooed on her shoulder before she passed. And the daisy was my father's favorite flower. The only iconic, really, image that had been passed around my family of my dad was him kneeling behind his daisies in front of our garden back home in Aliquippa. So it was so eerie, all of these so-called coincidences with Molly and the way she was expressing through me. And really, she still does today. And it was that dream about all of the girls coming out of the woods with cuts on their arms was an indication, because Molly had gone through a lot of difficult periods in her life. And a lot of these kids today, they do what's called cutting, where they cut themselves because it's a way of controlling their own pain, personal pain. And I didn't understand that concept until, you know, I met Molly and her family and some of her best friends, and they explained to me what this whole thing is that kids do now. So that's where that dream had culminated after I came back from meeting with the dad. And he was telling me about her life, and I looked through her computer and all these things. It was flying back home to North Carolina, where I went into this deep state and fell into that dream and saw all these girls coming out of the forest with these cuts on their hands. And I was kind of like, in my mind's eye, screaming and saying, you know, tell me how I can help you. Because it was an effort to try to help Molly and to understand what she had been going through, you know, in her own life. So yeah. That's the long version.
Well, the reason I brought it up is I felt the strong pull from your book that Molly wants the word to get out that this is not the way to go, that there are other ways to find help, and there are other ways to deal with your pain.
Exactly. That was the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have come to the end of our time. At the end of each of these episodes, I ask the guest to leave the audience with a couple words of wisdom. And your book is just full of them. So I don't know how you're going to pull just a couple, but you've got about 2 minutes to leave the audience with what you'd like to leave them with as thoughts.
Well, thank you. It went quick, Mom. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a delightful interview with you. Thank you. Well, here's what I'd like to say. The crux of my entire experience when I was taken up into the ethereal and I became part of this divine web of love and light, and I understood then that these quarks are the smallest building blocks of matter, and they're made of light. And I understood in that place, it was shown to me that these quarks combine to create infinite possibilities in the universe. They can become a planet, a blade of grass, a dog, or a person. And then it struck me that God uses light to create, heal, and transform us. And that whether it's an animate object or inanimate object, we're all made of the same cosmic stuff. It's the same recipe. We're all one. We're all connected. And when we realize that we all come from this divine web of love and light, that is when we'll find peace within ourselves and peace within our world.
That's a great message. So, audience, as I always ask you to do, keep in mind what you've heard, maintain what resonates with you, put the rest on a shelf to pull down later when you're ready to deal with it. And until next time, this has been your spiritual journey.